Good morning. I hope you slept well, as me. And as you know from the printed program, we divided each conference day to 3 sessions: morning session, afternoon session, and the evening session. And each consists of 3 papers, except of one, but there was the tomorrow evening, but this woman gave up, so there will be also 3. So it looks very structured, and my idea was, as you know from my emails, that each paper will be something like 25 minutes. Well, I hope so. 25 minutes, and then the discussion. The 3 papers will be followed by the discussion. So in order to save time, I suggest to the speaker to note questions and to answer by the end of this question session, each of them. Right, the first session, the morning session, and the first speaker actually is Katarzyna Murawska-Muthesius, who is a professor. I don't know, this is the British system, so a lecturer or a senior lecturer or something like this, but let's say professor, right? This is a much more universal name. So professor of art history at Birkbeck College, University of London, for a couple of years, actually 3 times. Katarzyna was employed in the National Museum in Warsaw from the beginning as a curator of Italian painting, and then as a chief curator, and finally as a deputy director. But we've been working together, so it was my great pleasure to work together with Katarzyna. I'm not sure that will be the 4th time. Anyway, and she was also teaching in Berlin twice, once as a Vertreter. When Adam Labuda left, he's retired. So the Institute für Kunst und Bildgeschichte at Humboldt-Universität had a problem to find out the successor. But so there was one, but the second one, this is the much more permanent project. This is the Rudolf Arnheim professorship, and last year Katarzyna was teaching there. So a couple of books I'd like to mention here. There is the Europäische Malerei aus dem Nationalmuseum Warschau, published 1988. Triunfo Barocco, 1990. Borders in Art, Revisiting Kunstgeografie, 2000. There was a conference actually in Norwich, and the book is a sort of preceding of this very interesting and very important conference dealing with Kunstgeografie. National Museum in Warsaw Guide, Galleries and Study Collections. And she edited, while working last time in the museum, she edited bilingual, actually, the two different editions of Jan Matejko, Battle of Grunwald. This collection of essays on this in English and Polish. The other book published in Britain is on Tadeusz Kantor. Kantor was here, Tadeusz Kantor in Great Britain, 2000, published 2011, and now she is working on the collection of essays dealing with the museum. This is from Museum Critique to the Critical Museum, which is also proceeding. The beginning of this book was a conference in Open University. What was there in? Yeah, but where it was, I don't remember. It was the Open University, Milton Keynes. Anyway, so this is a short bio. Thank you very much that you found time to come here, and the floor is yours. maybe that one. You can see it.
Thank you very much for such a nice presentation. I just wanted to add that this collection of essays from the museum to the Critical Museum, I'm actually co-editing with Piotr, and obviously he actually removed his name.
Well, actually, I am just the editor's assistant. This is actually, her work. Yeah. So she was so polite and invited me, to be an assistant to this book.
Oh no! Don't put the blame on me.
Yeah.
Okay.
This is your idea in your book.
All right. So I'm going to talk about the ideas of representation and self-representation of Eastern Europe. So from Eastern Europe as the other to the notion, to the concept of the Eastern Europe as the self, as the desirable self, and the way in which this notion of the self could be detectable, or in a way could be categorized by the book covers. So, in a way, the kind of the underpinning question is something that has been bothering me for a long time. Perhaps I shouldn't worry about it, but I still do. Whether there is something like the region, whether there is Eastern Europe, to what extent the Eastern Europe is a construct. So, anyway, I'll better carry on. Ego ideals of Eastern Europe. The boundaries of Eastern Europe, Central Europe, East Central Europe, or Southeast Europe, all devised at different historical times and serving different political agendas, are superimposed on each other, fluid and impossible to disentangle. When composed of the endless stream of ideas and rival ideologies, of the endless variety of artifacts rooted in Slavic, Latin, Orthodox, Jewish, and Islamic cultures, looking up to Parisian, Viennese, Moscow, and New York-derived canons, our region seems to collapse in the process of its construction, revealing instead its essential hybridity, plurality of cultural traditions and allegiances, competing models of modernity, freedom, and democracy, and the dreams of building the new world that are dogged by traumas, violence, and displacements. The constructed identities of these regions, or of a region, unnamed, still unnamed, in fact. I mean, we are using Eastern Europe. We are using the term Eastern Europe, but we mean actually sometimes Eastern Europe, sometimes East Central Europe. So still, the region is unnamed and definitely spatially unfixed, which is composed of the elements of East, Central, and Southeast Europe, have been widely debated by scholars since the late 1980s. Sparked by the provocative thesis of Milan Kundera on cultural allegiances of Central Europe, the debates were subsequently developed by the groundbreaking research of cultural historians and geographers, such as, everybody knows that, Larry Wolff on the invention of Eastern Europe, Stefan Trebst from Leipzig, and Robert Magoshi, the geographer, on the boundaries of East or East Central Europe, as well as by Maria Todorova, Wendy Braswell, and Vesna Goldsworthy, all female actually, on the cultural construction of the Balkans. After the fall of the wall, art history, East and West, also joined the debates about eastern peripheries of Europe, bringing the seminal contributions to the field by Thomas da Costa Kaufmann, Stephen Mansbach, Piotr Piotrowski, seminal catalogs. Of course, I'm not going to mention all of them, but those kind of the major catalogs in the field, or the earliest one by Zdenka Badowinacz, Bojana Page, Joanna Mytkowska recently, collaborating with her French colleague, and then important books, and again I'm mentioning those perhaps earlier books such as Andrzej Szczerski on the identity, cultural identity of Central Europe, or Maria Oryszkowa on art history, on the position of art history versus East Central Europe. And of course there are many other books. there have been loads of conferences. So again, I'm not going to mention all of them. It's impossible, but it's actually would be paid at some stage in a way to to write the historiography of the construction of the region after 1989. So the series of conferences, such as the mega event under the auspices of the Clark Art Institute, debated endlessly the unfolding narratives of art histories in East Central Europe after 1989, the multiplicity of national tradition, the directionality of networks, while problematizing its peripheral relationship with the former West, and advocating a global perspective as an approach to art studies in East Central Europe. And this is what our conference is going to be about, and we are going to hear about it. I mean, we've already heard yesterday night a very interesting contribution to this kind of rethinking how to think about global art history. I wonder to what extent this is actually applicable to Central Europe, but that's, I'm sure that will be the issue of the debates, of the topic of our discussion. Last year saw the publication of research of younger art historians, Clara Kemp-Welch and Amy Brisgall, on nonconformist art strategies in Central European art and on performance art in Eastern Europe, respectively. New conferences or conference panels are proliferating, just to mention the very event in Lublin. And at that time, eventually, I would like to thank all the organizers for organizing the event and to in such an important city, which, as I have wandered through Lublin yesterday, I thought that the places like the location of Gardzienice office, Lublin reminds me of Berlin, those Hinterhofs, which offer such which gives the city such a freedom. I mean, for me, Lublin is almost kind of the next Berlin. Warsaw is seen as is seeing itself as the next Berlin, but I think that Lublin is the next in this order. And so first of all, I want to thank organizers for Piotr and Waldemar Tatarczuk for organizing the conference in such a marvelous place, and also for being so incredibly hospitable to all of us and to make us feeling welcome and looked after. So just to mention this, the very event in Lublin, or the two forthcoming British Association of Art Historian Conference in 2015, which is again in Norwich, in University of East Anglia, and it's going to the conference is going to have two sessions on Eastern Europe, which are led by by the two of just mentioned scholars, Clara and Amy. One on the emergence of Central European identities post-1919, and the second on subversive practices and imagined realities in Central, Eastern, and Southern Europe post-1945. Clearly, the determination to both define and to problematize the transnational identity of the regions, evasive and transient, does not go away, as confirmed on another level by the rise of Facebook communities, such as Why We Study Eastern Europe, a group of almost 2,300 members and rising. There are already more of them. I'm actually a member of it. It's not for art. I mean, it's not only for art historians, although some art historians, such as me, actually have joined it. And there are other Facebook communities, such as, the one which is perhaps familiar to many of you, Art and Heritage in Central Europe, which is a kind of web page, kind of official website by Ahis, but infinitely more popular, because there are only just over 1,000 likes, but infinitely more popular with almost 31,000 likes, and probably even more now, by now, scholarships and fellowships for Eastern European and Central Asian students. So there's already an interesting global element in it. So what are we searching for? And why are we so keen on doing that? Is it still a mission, a political project of putting the excluded region back on the map of Europe and the world? Or is it an opportunity for younger scholars? And another question, who are we? My own contribution to this process of the invention and kind of defining, redefining, and thinking about East Central Europe has not been focused directly on art in East Central Europe, but on the visual production of knowledges about the region, disseminated by Western iconotext, to use a term introduced by Peter Wagner, by maps and cartoons operating between the realm of the visual and the textual, comparing different visual cartographic regimes employed to represent the cultural and political entities of Slavic Europe, Eastern Europe, Communist Europe, and post-Communist Europe. I argued that it is the maps which have played a leading role in both the construction and the legitimization of the collective identity of this region, petrifying the discourses about Eastern Europe as the other, actually, petrifying the discourse about the absence, cultural absence of Eastern Europe, which is seen as a white, as a black hole, you may say, white spot on the map, stressing the spread of the Roman Empire. Also petrifying or disseminating, another instance of disseminating and diffusion of its makeup of small and powerless states. And this is a typical representation of East Central Europe, which is always represented as a kind of vertical slice of the otherwise horizontal map of Europe, in a kind of portrait of those very small states which are squeezed and kind of uncomfortably crowded in this Zwischen Europa space. And you can see that this discourse, which is initiated in 1916, this is a map proposed by Seton Watson during the First World War, and this discourse of this vertical portrait of the Central Europe with those borders which are constantly, which are unclear, you know, they are not drawn as kind of as a series of spots, which are constantly changing, and this kind of the absence of certain countries on the map, and then they sudden appearance, this kind of sense of confusion and sense of struggle, defining in-betweenness and instability, which is reflected not only in the changing borders, but also in the kind of, from the linguistic point of view, in the shifting names given to the region. This is the map of the New Europe. This atlas, this is the edition, Historic Atlas of Central Europe, but the previous edition it says Historical Atlas of East Central Europe. So this is a constant kind of ill-defined region, both geographically and linguistically. And I have some other maps which I have removed from my presentation, but the kind of which project this notion of this natural propensity to be subjugated. So this is all about the Eastern Europe as the other. This is, I spent a long time actually on looking at it. But if the stereotype of the region as the other, even if it is, and this is my response to some of you, even if it is just the next door other, the close other, has become widely recognizable. Its markers of otherness, established also with the help of caricature, such as the caricature by David Law, and cartoons, also history books and books written by politicians and cultural historians. Could we, and this is now the question, could we identify an inhabitable subjectivity, a desirable image, the image of the East Central European self, to which we would aspire, actually, or in other words, the ego ideal? I suspect that this task is almost impossible to fulfill, not only because we would have trouble in agreeing on the major markers of the desirable transnational collective identity, but also because of the fact that the very idea of articulating the ego ideal of any region sounds terribly vague. Obviously, I have borrowed the term from Sigmund Freud, who developed this notion in his text on narcissism of 1914, and in later papers, including Mourning and Melancholia, 1917, and then in his text Group Psychology and the Analysis of the Ego, 1921. For Freud, ego ideal importantly, is closely bound up with the concept of superego. In a way, ego ideal serves to in the formation of the concept of superego, which comes in Freud's writing later. So, for Freud, ego ideal is both positively valued as the primary target of self-love. This is this identity to which we want to inhabit. In a way, we want to return to it because it was enjoyed by us in childhood, as he claims. But, he adds, for the ego, the formation of an ideal would be the conditioning factor of repression, of the removal. This is no longer Freud. I'm kind of trying to translate it in a way, of the removal of the unwanted features purged by the prohibitive superego. So this dual motivation of the ego ideal, suspended between idealizing self-identification and repression, which is the result of this prohibitive parent superego, was developed further by Stephen Frosch, for instance, who advocated the use of psychoanalysis in studies of society. Of course, he's just one of the many people in this group, in his numerous texts on group identities. And precisely, it is the ambiguity of the ego ideal which I find particularly significant for the why of the search for the Eastern European identity. The concept of the ego ideal, of course, was used in a similar context many years ago by Slavoj Žižek in 1990. A very much quoted paragraph from him, especially by, of course, East Central Europeans, albeit he was less concerned with the shared ego ideal which works for East Europeans, but rather with identifying Eastern Europe as the ego ideal for the West Europeans, and further identifying it with the naive gaze by means of which Eastern Europe stares back at the West, fascinated by its democracy. Does it still stand? That's the question. So, what kind of images of Eastern Europe should we analyze as equivalent to the Freudian ego ideal or the Lacanian mirror image, the adoption of the imagined visual truth about the identity of the subject? I'm not talking about caricature. Actually, caricature trope does not project the image of the self in other way than by imaging the other. It's much more complicated, but I'm not going into that into this paper. Maps could be more helpful here, and Pavel Szafazik's map of the 1840s, emphasizing Slavdom as the common denominator of the region, could be seen as this is the first map of Slavic Europe, produced in 1842. So that could be seen as one of the first manifestations of self-love, albeit a repressive, obviously, articulation of the Eastern European self, which is hostile to any un-Slavic component, to Hungary, for instance, which is represented here within this map as the other. Let us step into the domain of high art produced in the region. Are there any works which project successfully an image of the desirable East Central European transnational collective identity? Are there paintings, sculptures, or buildings which could function as positively valued emblems of East Central Europe, in a way similar to that in which Sergei Eisenstein shots, frescoes by Diego Rivera, or drip paintings by Jackson Pollock have been constructed and widely promoted as signifiers of Soviet Russia, engaged art of the Latin America, or the freedom of the West, respectively? In spite of all the obstacles, historical and methodological, I will try to have a go. However, instead of selecting the art or works of art myself, I will take a shortcut by analyzing the choices that have already been made by curators of exhibitions of art in East Central Europe and by authors and publishers of the major books on the topic, just by singling out the image for the cover. Clearly, the act of selecting an artwork for the cover frames it as the key image, not only capable of visualizing some aspects of the argument inside, but also strong enough to attract a potential reader, to drag him or her into the field. By contributing to the iconosphere as the visual signifiers of East Central European culture, the book covers inadvertently enter the battle for signification and can be subjected in the same way as maps to visual discourse analysis. So the rest of this paper will be a simple survey of the reproductions of the works of art or architecture. Actually, I'm not going to talk much about architecture, as well as art-inspired covers. I have grouped the covers thematically. So this is now, in a way, a second point, dividing them according to their correspondence to a tentative set of identities. This is ethnic, aesthetic, and socio-political, which have emerged at different stages, I would like to claim, since the 19th and throughout the 20th century as the dominant features of East Central European collective. And the list includes, in order of their appearance, Latin Europe, the notion of belongingness to the Latin sphere of civilization. Then Slavdom, that was very strong, also in 19th century. Jewishness, modernity. Here I put avant-garde, or the notion of this kind of newness of the new Europe, of avant-garde produced in New Europe. Communism, then resistance to communism, or dissidence, which I have put here, and then a quest for a new post-communist identity, whatever it means. Either adopted or imposed, both intertwined and fiercely oppositional, all of them have been recognized as markers of identity by significant cohorts of people across national borders, even if not all of them were perceived as desirable or shared by all East Central European nations. Widely debated then and now, they still function as pinpointers of identity, both of difference and sameness. And sameness is indeed stressed by the covers of books on early modern art in East Central Europe, such as the image of the arcaded courtyard in Jindřichov Castle in South Bohemia, chosen for the cover of Jan Białostocki's book on the art of the Renaissance in Eastern Europe, published in 1976. That was one of the first, in a way, book which claimed the common identity of the region, stressing this belongingness to Latin culture. And then, of course, that Thomas da Costa Kaufmann important book, which was already, I mean, everybody knows that, and which shows the image of Viennese Belvedere as the kind of signifier of Central Europe. But now I'm going on to the 20th century art. I'm kind of moving away from architecture. Because the covers, perhaps I'm not wrong. I'm actually not, well, I suspect some kind of comments from you, actually. So in the section of 20th century art, one of the most visible ego ideals of East Central Europe is that of modernity, expressed by various embodiments of geometrical abstraction, from Mihailo Petrov's Zenithist composition on the cover of the pioneering Mansbach book, to a series of suprematism-inspired logos of the exhibitions and books about Central European avant-gardes. And the most captivating are those on the publications accompanying the show in the Los Angeles County Museum of Art in 2002. The one on the left, by turning Malevich's Red Square into a kind of cultural parachute, literally reinvents the map of the region, replacing this former that I've been showing, this vertical portrait, the cluster of small states squeezed within the narrow zone of Zwischen Europa by the utopian project of a brave new Europe, exuding the sense of newness and radicalism. United under the shadowless Red Square, East Central Europe acquires a new strong identity, turning into a space of radical construction, social transformation, democracy, and transnationalism. And indeed, the idiom of the Red Square proved capable of interpellating both Slavic barbaro-geniuses, converting a presumed Balkan cultural deficiency into a barbarian power, and Jewish constructivists alike. The concept of modernity as the foundation of the region's shared identity has been compellingly promoted by Andrzej Szczerski in his recent book on the interwar period, which was shown on the previous slide. But also by David Crowley's electrifying notion of socialist modernism as the so far unacknowledged common denominator of the communist bloc post-Second World War. Mangelo's Red Globe of 1978, bearing an inscription Energia, chosen for the cover of the MIT source book for Eastern and Central European art since the 1950s, communicates, at least for me, the same message. If the idiom of modernity makes the most attractive logo of the region, numerically dominant covers referring to the shared experience of communism, even if the books themselves cover art which developed in opposition to it. The revolutionary red of the avant-garde turns into a signifier of evil, reproducing the otherwise familiar truths about trauma, captivity, and subjection, which could hardly stand today for an ego ideal. In fact, communism as an unfinished project, which was developed by the avant-garde or pro-communist art in East Central Europe post-1945, rarely features in those publications, with the exception of Bojana Page, Gender Check. It is resistance against totalitarianism, the subversion of the insignia of the Soviet power, which is being promoted as the shared identity of East Central European art. The identity which, once repressed, is now elevated to the dominant one. A similar strategy underpins the garish yellow, or doesn't mean to be gold, starred on red background on the cover of East Art Map project by Irwin of 2006, which aims to reconstruct the missing history of contemporary art, art networks, and art conditions in Eastern Europe from the East European perspective. Irwin's project is accessible online, and it proposes yet another strikingly cartographic vision of the repressed self of East European art. It is shown as an expanding galaxy of stars and planets, which, having emerged from under the black veil of communism, this is black veil of communism, are spreading ad infinitum into the space of global art world. The East Art Map, if we apply this kind of knowledge about the cartographic ego ideal of Eastern Europe, the East Art Map could be seen as a follower of Szafazik's map, but instead of pointing to Slavdom, has chosen the avant-garde. I'm tempted to say that the images of resistance dominate also the realm of post-communist identity, as testified by covers of recent books and catalogues of contemporary art in East Central Europe, which invariably adopt images from the 1960s and the 1970s. Even if the works are complex, when selected as cover images, they are almost automatically hailed by the old regimes of the discourse about East Central Europe and turned into the signifiers of confinement and exclusion, of objectification and inner emigration, and of the desire to escape. An interesting choice presents the cover of the recent book by Piotr on the relationship between art and the formation of democracy in post-communist Europe. This is a frame from the 1999 video installation of the Serbian artist Milica Tomic, who, dressed only in a white petticoat, keeps introducing herself in various languages by saying her name, followed by a range of imagined national and ethnic identities. Ich bin Milica Tomic, Ich bin Deutsch. Sono Milica Tomic, sono Italiana. Jestem Milica Tomic, jestem Polką, etc., etc. Her adopted identities range widely from European, East European to American, African, and Asian. Young, beautiful, and perfectly composed, she turns around while she speaks, as if not noticing that every time she declares her new identity, her model-like body acquires a new bleeding wound, administered by an invisible hand. The scene, staged on a loop, lasts just under 10 minutes, and at the end she is covered in blood, her white gown soiled. The performance is explained on the artist's website in terms of violence associated with the adoption of any collective identity, and even more so with gender oppression. Pace Freud. I mean, not about gender oppression, but adoption of this collective identity. Piotr, who discusses Tomic's installation in a chapter on post-communist art, addressing the issue of nationalism, claims that almost inevitably, in spite of the universalizing message conveyed by the performance, the viewer who knows that the artist's nationality is Serbian would contextualize this work with the experience of the Balkan Wars, the violence in the name of ethnic difference. For the argument of this paper, it is also very likely that the image of a wounded female body with a long ethnic plate on the cover of the book on art of post-communist Europe would also be associated with the well-established discourses on violence and martyrdom, gender oppression, and political subjections of the communist Europe. There is no conclusion to this paper, apart from my concurring with Milica Tomic's claim that any declaration of a new identity is indeed an act of violence. The old regimes of signification and perception are hard to eradicate, and the new construction of the East Central European group person are often misunderstood. Moreover, as we have learned from Freud, the adoption of a new sense of selfhood is almost inevitably accompanied by the repression, the denial of the old, or the kind of unwanted selves, which are unwanted at the moment. Likewise, not only the cultural expressions of the enforced communist identity are entirely erased from the picture, but the distinctive transnational ethnicities of East Central Europe, that of the Slavic majority, which is discussed by literary historians such as Maria Janion, the Polish literary scholar, or anthropologists, ethnologists, talking about Slovanski Svet, oczyma badatelu a publicistu. This is, I cannot read that, of the 19th and 20th century. So those of Slavic majority and that of the Jewish minority, those distinctive transnational ethnicities of Slavic majority and Jewish minority are either absent on art historical books or hard to find on art book covers at least. The last years brought an increasing recognition of the Jewish contribution to the construction of East Central European identity, and we have a book which treats, and of course it has got a Jewish image on the cover, under the title Jewish Artists and East Central Europe. I have also added a book edited by Maria Dmitrieva and Heidemarie Petersen on Jewish cultures in New Europe, focusing actually on Vilnius, 1918 to 1939. I said the last year brought an increasing recognition of the Jewish contribution to the construction of the East Central European identity, but also of the Eastern European roots of the Jewish one. And I would claim that this topic requires separate attention, and the recent openings of the Jewish museums in Warsaw and in other cities of the region are likely to contribute to the realigning of the field. And also my kind of trip through Lublin yesterday, in a way, confirmed this sense that this is the Jewish identity, that, okay, it's fine to look at, I mean, we have to look to South America, India, and to position Eastern Europe versus the whole global world. But let us not forget about those identities which had been repressed for long time. And perhaps we could make something out of that as well. So that's it.
Thank you very much, Kasia. And the next speaker is Eva Forgacz, who is teaching right now as an adjunct professor of art history at the Art Center College of Design in Pasadena, but also her experience in teaching is much wider. She was teaching in Budapest, and also as a visiting professor at the UCLA and the College in Santa Fe, as well as College of Art and Design in Los Angeles. Also, let me mention two other experiences. Eva's experience. One is as a curator, and the second as the writer. So as a curator, she was a co-curator of the exhibition of Monuments of the Future designed by Lisitsky in the Getty Research Institute in 1998. And also, she cooperated with what we saw, the book cover, with Tim Benson, the Exchange and Transformation Central European Avant-Garde, which was shown at LACMA and Munich and Berlin. And I'm going to say something about her editorial experience. Eva was a co-editor of the first anthology of Central European avant-garde writings, which was published along with this exhibition. It's called Between Wars, a source book of Central European avant-garde. So there was, as I said, the first in English, a source book published actually by MIT Press. Also, let me mention that Eva is a review editor of Centropa. It's a very small, you might know this, but it's a very small journal, something like almost private journal based in New York City. Anyway, books. I like to mention two books. One is the Bauhaus, a very famous book, the Bauhaus Idea and the Bauhaus Politics, published twice, 1991 and 1995, and Laszlo Feher in Budapest, 1998. All right. The title of today's talk is Between Local and Global, Double Bind and Double Challenge. Please, Eva, you have it. Floor.
Thank you, Bert, for this very nice introduction, and also thank you for inviting me here. I'm very much looking forward to all the rest of this conference. Yes, I would like to talk about double bind of East Central European art, and I'm trying to engage your attention without images this time. So regarding the problems specific to Central and East European art in the global perspective, which was the conference's topic, I would like to examine the traditional East-West and East-East interconnectedness, divergence, and communications issues, which have had a long history and significance in both the international and the local reception of Central and East European art. As scholars like Larry Wolff pointed out, Eastern Europe was seen as the land of the uncouth, a contrast to Western law and order, rationalism and efficiency throughout the last 3 centuries at least, when Westerners took to traveling and tourism and explored this part of Europe. This traditional approach has not quite worn off, even if we examine the current position of the region in the international art scene. The sudden collapse of communism and the Soviet Union in the fall of 1989 and the winter of 1991, respectively, created a situation in Central and Eastern Europe that was not unlike that of the post-World War I moment in 1918, when the newly minted nation-states set out to construct their particular cultural narratives at the same time as they sought to integrate into a new international culture. We all know that prior to 1989, dual or even more multiple art historical narratives existed in the Central and East European countries, which had different and differently changing local political conditions in each country and various thresholds of tolerance and censorship. However, there was, on the one hand, in each of these lands, a censored official narrative of state-sponsored and state-approved art, and on the other hand, in the shadow of this existed a non-official narrative of the art that was different, oppositional, underground, avant-garde, neo-avant-garde, rebellious, potentially subversive, and could be viewed in semi-public or private locations only. This second narrative was often further split into progressive, Western-oriented, internationalist neo-avant-gardes, which projected progress as the vision of a future, and folklore-based nationalist trends, which projected tradition, that is the past, as a desirable future. Both had further ramifications and subdivisions along conceptual or personal fault lines. The historical turning point in 1989 radically changed the status quo. Everything came out into the open, and international presence was not only possible, but requested. The institution of the art market was reinstated and thus brought a potentially wide audience into the art scene, while such an audience had not been in sight during the communist times. Art criticism and curatorial work became real, and aesthetic theory had gained ground too, in an effort to support the emerging or reconstructed narratives. In the light of all this, as public discourse became direct and open instead of coded, the deficiencies and contradictions of the local narratives became visible. It had to be made clear what constituted an important and valuable part of the culture and why. The agents of the respective art scenes of these countries faced a near impossible dual task. On the one hand, to construct a valid national narrative out of scattered fragments and contradictory storylines, and on the other hand, keep up with the current trends and concepts of the unfolding global art scene. As Polish curator and art writer Aneta Szylak wrote about art in Poland, I quote her, "We are asked to define our Polishness when what is expected is a kind of universalism. Organizations are rewriting art history according to where they find legitimate antecedents. Previously unquestionable intellectual and political traditions are being reviewed, revisited, and sometimes recuperated, galvanized, and reenacted. It is as if the past is being reinvented in order to control the future," end quote. These words described a double task cut out for each Central and East European artist and art historian, which was further complicated because at the time of the region's comeback to the international scene, where Central and East European art enjoyed temporary popularity and distinguished interest in the early 1990s, the expectations of the West were clearly articulated. An unequivocal picture of the dramatic historical changes was demanded. Exhibitions of before and after. The suggested narrative was modeled on the destruction of the Berlin Wall. On November 8, 1989, it was still there, but on November 9, it was gone. Such a dramatic scenario of liberation was clear-cut and fascinating. It was a dazzling chronicle of lived history, and after all, it was true. Or was it? It was not possible to bend the artistic production and history of the region to such a suggested narrative Because neither the political changes in Central and Eastern Europe nor the changes in the art and culture happened overnight. There was no spectacular before and after story, even if there were indeed a few before and after exhibitions. For example, there was one of Hungarian art, an exhibition in Washington, D.C. The crumbling of the communist states and the loosening of their grip on the art and culture was a gradual process throughout the 1980s. And as local opposition to the system had gained ground at different speed and in different ways in every country, it was the more and more clear that opposition groups were a complicated mix of liberals and conservatives, internationalists and nationalists, with further ramifications of both, who would never accept each other's long-cherished or newly constructed historical narratives. Moreover, some of the incarnations of the international trends that emerged in the East had different meaning there than in the West. For example, conceptual art was clearly anti-capitalist in the West. It was a strong protest against the power of the market and the marketable art object, while in the East European environment, where there had been no market, and to be poor was not a movement's program, like in the case of Arte Povera in Italy, but a condition to protest against. Tinkering, the use of rough materials in rough, intentionally poorly executed artistic objects that several East European artists chose to use as aesthetic language, did not express contempt for money, but much rather its humiliating absence. Another difficulty of sharing the East European narratives with the rest of the world was that while Westerners were curious to see the spectacular liberation story of Eastern Europe, they were not prepared to learn a whole parallel art history, complete with a new geography and a plethora of yet unknown, hard-to-pronounce names. What was in demand, in fact, at least on the level of the immediate curatorial and critical interest, was a streamlined narrative that would quickly disclose basic information about Central and East European art. Of course, the mutual understanding among different cultures has always been a challenge. Besides the universal features, local codes have always pervaded every culture and artwork. Certain words and concepts are loaded with meanings that are valid only in one local context only. Local historians may be inclined to tell insider narratives with many nuances, which may be too complicated for outsiders to fully understand. But outsiders, even if they do accurate research, may miss many important meanings, may misplace emphasis, and end up misinterpreting a chapter or another of a local culture. Outsider, quote unquote, may be geographically or demographically a stranger. A scholar belonging to a younger generation may be almost as distanced from the artistic developments of a certain era as a scholar from a different culture. Therefore, it is, I think, of particular importance to own solid and multifaceted, all-inclusive local narratives that are based on the consensus of the concerned agents. The availability of solid local narratives is the precondition of mutually understanding each other and to have valid representation on the global art scene. Such a narrative ideally includes the histories and characterization of the parallel, different, competing trends of every era, complete with the list of the artists, art critics, curators and dealers, collectors, theorists, and all other possible constituents of a given art scene. Such consensual narratives have been achieved in one or another of the Central and East European cultures to some extent, but at different levels. Opening a publication on contemporary art in Eastern Europe, or contemporary art in general, one encounters entirely different representatives of the respective East European cultures, because on the global scene, consistently with the polyvalent views and moderate information on these cultures, one or another artist fits into one or another curatorial or editorial concept. To narrow it down on Hungarian art, which I know best, there seems to be an almost total chaos that I can demonstrate with a couple of examples. A few publications that offer a survey of East European art include Hungarian artists who belong to entirely different artistic pursuits and programs without any indication that they are parts of a bigger picture. For example, in the otherwise excellent volume Primary Documents, the Kasia just showed the front page of it, published in 2002 by MoMA in cooperation with the MIT Press, 3 Hungarian names appear altogether. That of conceptual artist Miklós Erdély, conceptualist, poet, and performance artist Tibor Hajas, and sculptor and performance artist Imre Bukta. While all 3 are, or some of them were, because they're not around anymore, important artists, they represent only specific fragments of the Hungarian art of the era discussed in the volume, the subtitle of which is A Source Book for Eastern and Central European Art and Architecture since 1950. Thus, the actual narrative of the Hungarian art of the second half of the 20th century is reduced to 2 iterations of conceptualism and one sculptor, while the artistic developments of other European countries are amply discussed and documented in this bulky volume. Contemporary Hungarian art received even worse treatment in the 2010 exhibition and catalogue titled Contemporary Art in Eastern Europe. Kasia also showed that cover. I should have borrowed it. Only one Hungarian artist was included among the 56 participants, painter Dora Maurer. Her exhibited paintings, dated from 1984 to 1992, are described in the catalogue as early works, whereas Maurer's early works were surrealist etchings that dated from the early 1970s. Maurer may be seen as representative of one of the many trends in contemporary Hungarian art, but how could she, or any one artist, represent the entire Hungarian artistic culture of the present? The result is, of course, a skewed image, suggesting that Hungarian art is only 1 per 56 of the East European art scene, and this is certainly not realistic. Although Piotr Piotrowski gave the most balanced survey of the East European art between 1945 and 1990 in his book In the Shadow of Yalta, such lapses in the surveys of any other Central and East European countries' art may have often occurred in other exhibitions and publications as well. The construction of consensual local narratives and more careful considerations in editing and curatorial work are the more pressing task, not only for the sake of correct representation, or at least proportionate representation, but also because we have come a long way since 1989. Presently, a great number of international biennales, triennales, and other art exhibitions brought to visibility hundreds, if not thousands, of artists from all corners of the world whose names had been unknown, hard to pronounce, and hard to learn, but who attract attention on reasons that may be political, aesthetic, or pure business. The presence of a new global crowd of artists and a great number of forums where they appear have mitigated the particular position of the Central and East Europeans in the curatorial as well as the discursive global developments. The conditions have changed for both the management of contemporary art and the construction of a national narrative. Both need to be competitive on the very wide global scene. Because of this highly competitive global art scene, it is important that contemporary artists be backed up by a local community, that knows their value and their original context, and at the same time can provide a lineage, a historical background and narrative that informs the global community of that artist's position, traditionalist, innovative, or rebellious in his or her original context. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Eva. And the last speaker of morning session is Beata Hock. Beata is working mostly for, as far as I know her, for a couple of years in the comparative gender studies. And she's recently employed as a research associate in Leipzig in the Center for the History and Culture of East Central Europe, contributing a project, transnationalism and cultural identity. As I said, her research area is mostly feminist cultural theory and gender studies, and she's an author of many essays and articles on this area, applying and basing on Central Eastern Europe. And from her publications, let me mention just a recent book published a year ago, Gender Creative Options and Socialist Voices, Politics, Cinema and the Visual Arts in State Socialist and Post-Socialist Hungary. Beata, you have a floor, but you doesn't mention your title, Managing Trans/Nationality Cultural Actors with Imperial Structure.
Thank you. There is an S at the end of the title that kept disappearing all the time between the emailing. Thank you for the invitation and the introduction. I'm really thrilled because we are only after 3 talks, including also the keynote talk last night, and there are already so many connecting points across time periods. So I'm really interested what's going to come out of the whole of the conference. And I also have to tell that since the call for paper for this conference both invited topics on earlier periods and methodological perspectives, it cut right to the core of my recent academic work, which is a bit different than what you heard in the introduction. Because no, it's okay. I mean, it is a fascinating kind of like turn, because since 2011, I've been member of an interdisciplinary research group that set itself the goal to write or rewrite the history of East Central Europe from the perspective of transnational and global history. We are accomplishing this task along 5 so-called dimensions, some of which are subject fields called to life by global history itself, such as the intensive study of migration, territorialization, or the history of international organizations. The other 2 dimensions are actually traditional disciplines like economic and cultural history, which now had to be rethought and retold within this specific conceptual framework. In this talk, I will share with you some ways how I try to deal with this task. The period we've been investigating in the past 3 years spans the last third of the 19th century up to World War I. This period has 2 important aspects for us. Do I have to? Which direction do I point? Okay. So one of these important aspects is the impact of the recently emerging trend of empire studies. This branch of history reconstructed pre-20th century conventional national histories as a transnational history of empires. This was in acknowledgement that for millennia, diverse groups of people were often united by force in a certain territory, and so political organization had little to do with ethnic and national belonging or cultural unity. These are important insights for thinking of the cultural history of a region, East Central Europe, in the greater part of which the nation-state did not yet exist until the 20th century, and where state formations were instead a mixture of ethnic, religious, and language groups. The other aspect that is important for us is exploring the mechanisms of transnationalization during the period of the first globalization. Now, when economic historians refer to this period, like late 19th century, early 20th century, as the first globalization, they do not deny the existence of worldwide trade and artistic networks of earlier centuries, about which we heard last night in the keynote talk. Rather, what they want to underscore is that through a rapid development of transportation and mass communication, participating in global networks became a mass phenomenon, not reserved for selected individuals. So ever larger geographical areas and ever more aspects of social cultural life were drawn into cross-border entanglements during these decades. And here lies the challenge for Eastern European small nations. Here lies the challenge. Besides constructing their nations and national cultures and fighting for national independence or statehood, they at the same time had to also enter a global stage and position themselves on a market of consumer and cultural goods. What were their chances in the absence of national self-administration, and what were their strategies to manage the global condition, so to say? Within the broader discipline of history, a number of emerging trends pose challenges to writing, and now I'm coming close to the subject of art history. So within the broader discipline of history, a number of emerging trends pose challenges to writing cultural and art history within an exclusively national framework and within the dominant Western paradigm too. As you all are all aware, and some of the talks already touched upon this subject, the change was launched in the 1970s and 80s with new art history. From the late 1990s on, the concept of world art history and global art studies gave another new direction to the field. New art history took a socially oriented critical turn, taking account of the realities of the social world in which art has been created. Earlier preoccupations of the disciplines such as aesthetic quality, greatness, period style, iconography, the figure of the genius, the hierarchy of genres, were replaced by a terminology closer related to the social sciences. The term influence was also subjected to revision because, as critics say, it connotes one-directional processes and passive adoption. Newer theories prefer depicting more dynamic scenarios in which any movement of a cultural object from one place to another results in the transformation of its meaning. To transfer in this sense is not just to transport, but rather to actively rework and metamorphose, so that reformulations possess just as much legitimacy as the original, the supposed model. Also, authors became more attentive to the hierarchy of spatial regimes, or to put in simpler words, center-periphery relations, the divergence of historical developments, exploring the very factors that may have enabled or rather constrained certain developmental paths in any concrete location. Histories of art that have traditionally taken a national perspective disregard the fact that the phenomenon of interculturality had been the norm, so to say, in earlier historical periods, and we know a whole lot about these early cultural entanglements from the work of Professor da Costa Kaufmann, who extensively wrote about the times when no urge was yet felt to nationally compartmentalize the shared intellectual cultural field. The need to do so emerged with the modern 19th century idea of the nation as an enduring collective, and with the work of scholars who constructed territorially based histories of national culture, as it were. World art studies and the transnational approach to cultural history operate in quite a different manner. These methods do not so much conceive of the world as a quantitative sum of distinct national units defined by their borders, but here cross-border flows, international connections, and biographies of mobility are just as relevant part of the history of a country as events unfolding within the state boundaries. Following up processes of cultural appropriation and global exchange that shaped the visual arts throughout the past 5 or 6 centuries, world art history and global art studies opened up art historical inquiry towards non-core parts of the world. And as we've touched upon, again, this problem several times in the last couple of hours or half a day, the insights of, nevertheless, it only meant the inclusion of further territories like Asia, Africa, Latin America, but not so much Eastern Europe. The insights of post-colonial theory have also been particularly useful in capturing events and realities in those parts of the world that never possessed the epistemological power to participate in shaping historical master narrative, which is certainly the case with East Central Europe, the subject of our conference here in Lublin, and that's why I think some of the questions last night to the keynote talk addressed exactly this problem, how we can apply maybe a Netherlandish model for our geographical area. So keeping these preliminary remarks in mind, I want to argue that studying the cultural history of the East Central European region in a global framing promises to facilitate 2 tasks. Demonstrating East Central Europe's deep interconnectedness in a global web of cultural exchanges is part of this task, and that's what I call retrieving a sort of synchronous agency. This operation aims at reinstating the historical agency of cultural actors from the region as they engaged in, occasionally impacted on, or eventually sometimes consciously abstained from global processes emerging in the late 19th century. Through this operation, the cultural history of East Central Europe will be made visible and proposed as a productive subject field for global art history that has been largely ignored, this area. The second and perhaps more challenging job is achieving narrative or diachronic agency. In other words, deploying history writing as a kind of narrative strategy which may remove East Central European cultural history from the disadvantageous status it has acquired within the Western-focused cultural canon, a status often marked by the labels backward, delayed, imitative, or derivative. Ideally, this removal is not to be attained through simply showing up achievements that, so to say, stood comparison, or the value of which lies in the faithful imitation or brave appropriation of great models. The eventual ambition is to abandon such sort of normative comparisons and dethrone the dominant Western perspective as the single valid vantage point. I do have some fascinating examples to demonstrate the deep interconnectedness of East Central European cultural actors in this period, but for today I chose to focus on the second task, on achieving narrative and diachronous agency. So that's what I'm going to do in the second half of this talk. I want to showcase some recent scholarly projects engaging with the art history of Eastern Europe. And I will take the liberty to also dwell upon some of the best-known works on the period, even as I'm talking to an audience of art historians who are certainly familiar with the titles I am mentioning, and some of the titles have been already mentioned. One reason why I chose to nevertheless briefly summarize these undertakings is that they address a period in the past which we received relatively little attention at our conference in the next 3 days. And another reason is that I will actually assess these studies with regard to what degree and in what ways they operate with a transnational perspective. I've selected 2 English language monographs that were among the first to endorse newer cultural historical approaches and offer a comprehensive overview of the East Central European region. In the introduction to his monograph, Steven Mansbach expressed his aspiration to reintegrate the art of the European periphery within the mainstream history of European modernism. He hoped to achieve this through breaking with the unidimensional view of artistic movements that hides East Europeans' share in shaping the progressive artistic tendencies of the time. Rather than automatically adopting iconographic categories commonly used in modern European art history, the author was pressing for more nuanced local readings and an awareness of local geography. In the individual chapters, Munchbach indeed sketches the historical context of the area discussed there, but he appears to be lost as to how to utilize this background knowledge when treating individual artworks or oeuvres. At that point, well-entrenched categories and seminal figures of Western European art continue to haunt his narrative. The greatest achievement that Munchbach is capable to perceive through this lens is Eastern European artists' inventive adaptation of styles from abroad. This kind of framing, however, makes Eastern artists appear helplessly dependent on Western European influences, while also excludes the possibility of more sovereign contributions. I would suggest that here we face the limitations of the applicability of the theory of cultural transfer onto East-West encounters. As we already heard about it briefly last night, the notion of cultural transfer was originally formulated in the framework of a research project on Franco-German cultural relations carried out in the mid-1980s by Michel Espagne and Michael Werner. The question, however, arises whether the theory of cultural transfer is also capable to grant agency to both participants when it comes to an encounter between unequal parties. What I mean is that in the case of German-French encounters, we can talk about two dominant cultures, and it is therefore fairly plausible to assume that a dynamic, mutual, or two-directional intercultural dialogue took place. But it is less likely to take place in other, less balanced situations. This is not to say that appropriation, creative reworking, and radical changes in meaning do not take place when a dominant and a marginal culture comes into contact, but in such cases, reinterpretation and transposition appear to remain the task of the non-dominant party only, while the source of the influence, the communicator of the transferred message, remains fixed. And anyhow, talking about active reworking may sound little new to us. Such a rhetorical or conceptual tool has been a basic building block in the master narratives of peripheral locations, not wanting to create their own self-image as passive adaptors. A very typical account from 1922 stresses the act of conscious reformulation, if you wish, strategic adaptation, in the case of the Polish Artist Association Sztuka. Although the initiators of Sztuka had imbibed French culture, as the author and journalist Tadeusz Skarszewski wrote, they were far from the idea of transplanting French schools to Polish ground. They employed this culture rather as an antidote in the uprooting of German influence on Polish art. The art they wished to propagate in Poland was neither German nor French, but Polish. So this is in 1922, a message to Michel Espagne. Among several other authors, James Elkins has reviewed Munchbach's monograph, and Elkins' text is virtually a methodological attempt to better sort out dilemmas around peripheral location, relative isolation, historical cultural differences, a shared artistic vocabulary, and genuine creative accomplishment. Addressing the disturbing question, what is to be done about this problem of description, in which every work that is made at a distance from the center becomes a soup pot of styles from other countries, Elkins put forward a couple of guidelines, among them ways to distinguish various species of regionalism. An artist is regionalist when she or he knows what is happening in some other region, but decides to continue making art that is particular to his or her own culture. An artist is parochial when she or he knows something is happening in some other region, but is afraid to find out too much, not wanting to compromise their perception of their own unique contribution to their nation's art. And finally, provincialist is an artist who wants to know about art that is taking place in some other region, but is prevented from partaking in it for political or economic reasons. The other works comprehensive work I included on the slide before is Elizabeth Clegg's book, Art, Design and Architecture in Central Europe, 1890 to 1920, published in 2006. And the book takes Austro-Hungary as a cultural historical unit, and unlike Munchbach, who organizes his material according to present-day nation-states, Clegg focuses on 8 regional centers. And while Munchbach invests a lot in the aesthetic assessment of individual artists and artworks, Clegg's book is rather a contribution to the sociology of art, also embracing the entire institution of art. The author's take on national culture is diametrically opposed to that found in the majority of the local scholarly literature. Whereas art historians in the region tend to include in the national container artists and intellectuals who spent most of their professional careers abroad and might have never returned to their home countries, Clegg opts for avoiding such retrospective reappropriations and neglects such figures. This may be a viable viewpoint if one thinks about the many artists originating from and then leaving the region who no longer spoke their mother tongue very well or did not spend much time in their homeland. But it is a lot more debatable in situations in which some of the most ardent proponents of the national cause were driven to emigration or exile, where, quite far from severing links to their home regions, they continued their organizing and artistic work. Master narratives of Polish cultural history have an inclination to even overemphasize this circumstance in order to express that despite the conditions of the partition, dividing frontiers were ignored in both political and cultural life, as émigré circles' activities always targeted fellow Poles everywhere. This is again something like a transnational reach of cultural life if you take nation defined by political borders. Another debatable aspect of Clegg's dealing with historical actors and their national cultures is that she only seems to take ethnic belonging seriously, and the possibility of multiple cultural national identification, let alone a non-choice of one-dimensional monolithic identities, is hardly thinkable for her. However, this is a particular characteristic of late 19th century East Central European cultural landscapes that many recent research projects underline. Besides comprehensive academic studies, transnational perspectives on the East Central European cultural heritage have been proposed in the framework of exhibitions and their respective catalogues as well as individual articles. I will evoke 2 issues from this recent body of literature that respond in one way or another to a transnational approach. One is the inquiry into the possibility of cultural self-representation on an international or global stage in the case of nations still lacking statehood or autonomous cultural administration. The other one is a selection of so-called best practices or reflective ways to overcome the Eastern European backwardness complex. World fairs, international trade fairs, and art exhibitions began to be organized in the late 19th century. They were organized to bring prestige to the host city and country, to celebrate technological achievement and sell new products, to bring together specialists, as well as to provide popular education and entertainment for large audiences, and hence offered an incomparably broad overview of human creativity. In this capacity, world fairs greatly contributed to an emerging perception of a globe out there, beyond general reach, heterogeneous and unified at the same time. 19th century grand exhibitions also had their colonialist features. Participating countries were showing off their riches to home populations, rivals, and the world at large. In displaying colonies or internal colonies, the emphasis was not on the history of conquest and domination, but on indigenous cultural performance supported through colonial rule and the civilizing mission of the mother country or empire. The Habsburg monarchy likewise promoted its national diversity as an asset and conveyed a state image in which the empire guaranteed to each of its constituent nations the best possible conditions of development, masking, of course, very real disadvantages. For a very basic fact of this, regional units or occasional individual participants of the nationalities necessarily featured as parts of the Austrian display, not under their own national denominations. This often led to political calculations and confrontations. After the 1967 Austrian-Hungarian Compromise, the Hungarian kingdom gained sovereignty in matters of culture. Nevertheless, it was not before the 1900 Paris World Fair that the country built its own pavilion fully independently. The applied arts products on display in the Hungarian Hall bravely combined an internationally recognizable up-and-coming visual language, Art Nouveau, with elements of folklore and vernacular culture. This display did not only enjoy a noisy success, but earned an invitation for Hungary to erect its own national pavilion at the Venice Biennale. The Biennale had been in existence since 1895, but the first pavilion, the Belgian, was only built in 1906. Hungary's pavilion in 1909 came as the second. But as we learn from Kinga Bodi's excellent research, beside aesthetic considerations, the invitation was partly due to other extra artistic factors. The success of the particular visual style was itself conditioned on liberal Western European audiences' sympathy for the independent struggle of Central European nations, in which the inclusion of folklore and vernacular culture was very much welcomed. Yet another part of the favorable treatment Hungary received from the Italian host was connected to the still lingering gratitude towards Hungarian émigrés who had fought on the Italian side in the Third War of Independence against Habsburg Austria, who did not get an invitation to erect its own pavilion. There are several ways to unhinge East European modern art from a full dependence on developments in the Western mainstream. Alternative routes to transnational networks could be offered through cases in which the center is not so much perceived as an ultimate source of influences, but rather as a resource, providing an opportunity for margins that otherwise might be less likely to come together to take up contact. The above mentioned, that's where we want it to be. The above mentioned Paris World Fair in 1900 was home to such a center of resource kind of meeting between two European peripheries. The Hungarian triumph in Paris was attributable to the Gödöllő workshop. In the same year, another hit of the Paris exhibition was the output of another small nation, a group of Finnish artists clustering around the leading personality of Axel Igal and Kallela. Both groups drew on, but at the same time combined Europe-wide popular tendencies like Art Nouveau and the British arts and craft movement with motifs derived from their own vernacular culture. It was in Paris that these artists became aware of each other and their common creative aspirations. The result of their Parisian meeting was a lasting mutual inspiration, exhibition exchange, and commissions, which continued in the United States after World War I. I find especially innovative those methodological attempts that decenter or provincialize the artistic centers of the time, pointing out that it is sometimes only their definitional monopoly that makes particular junctures the center. I recalled earlier how Stephen Munchbach identified the pluralism and blending of artistic styles as a distinguishing feature of Eastern European modernism, but I also expressed doubts regarding the explanatory power and methodological value of his thesis. Another researcher, Csilla Markója, also goes back to the difference between how artistic styles developed in the Western centers and in other parts of Europe, but she follows an analytical strategy other than pointing to a mere skillful reworking of foreign influences. And she ends up with provincializing French Impressionism. Markója revisits Impressionism, the blueprint for late 19th century artistic progressivism, which came to overshadow other stylistic tendencies which at the time were equally noteworthy parcels of the much broader and much more heterogeneous spectrum of modern art. She shifts the focus on Stimmungsimpressionismus instead, a broadly practiced but later sidetracked artistic idiom. Back then, Stimmungsimpressionismus was also a preferred form of expression of several East Central European artists. In general art histories, their paintings are described today as national variations derived from apparent French Impressionism. Mark Goya argues that if we leave behind the usual East European provincialism and belatedness complex, which blocks one's view to notice genuine creative work, we may even challenge the universal relevance of Impressionism and its key position within the art historical canon. For we may reach the conclusion that it was not the national variations, but French Impressionism itself, which was a local, if you wish, provincial version, a logical, but after all particular outgrowth of a more widespread artistic style of its time. Meanwhile, Stimmung's Impressionismus turns out to have been perhaps the largest, the most comprehensive, unified, and progressive trend of the late 19th century, the impact of which ranged from Barbizon to the Hague School, to Wien, and to the Russian Empire, or further to the south, Italy. The author hopes that with this sort of methodology, and through bringing in as yet lesser studied artistic genealogies, the conventional developmental scheme of art history can be modified. Striking byways, detours, at times parallel paths will be made visible, and it shall become clear that the idea of artistic import should not suggest that all what is to be found east of Paris is second-rate stock or copied stuff. As the handful of theoretical propositions and methodological operations I presented in this talk show, in order to study East Central European cultural history on a transnational global level, a simple geographical enlargement of the study is not enough. Scholars must also turn analytically from para-Europe. The term para-Europe was introduced by Susan Zimmerman to capture a set of research methodologies and interpretations which are rooted in the dominant paradigms of thought within a nominally global, yet relentlessly Eurocentric or Western-centric academia. Eroding the legitimacy of such research designs brings to the surface an indeed multifaceted international picture. This methodological move helps reveal concepts and realities in other parts of the world, Eastern Europe, for example, that have been largely ignored or the existence of which has never been considered due to the limiting boundaries of para-European scholarly approaches. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Beata. And if you don't mind, I will ask you to have a seat just at the table. We have time to make a question session. So, as I said, my suggestion is that first you will raise questions, and by the end of this session, Beata, Kasia, and Eva will answer for these questions. Yeah, please.
Thank you very much. It was the great second day of the conference. And I have a question about terminology. Maybe for all three of you. You used the term, different terms. Eastern Europe, East Central Europe, or also Central Europe. The book of Jan Bolestocki, Kasia, you showed, is called The Renaissance Art in Eastern Europe. He means the Eastern Europe, including Hungary, Bohemia, Poland, and Russia as one artistic region. Da Costa Kaufmann, his book is a kind of answer to Bolestocki, called it Central Europe, and he took a frontier, so between Central and Eastern Europe in the church. So the Catholic region, or the Latin church, and the Orthodox church. And I saw also that Andrzej Szczerski and his book, in the Polish tradition, it's used to call it Europa Środkowo-Wschodnie, as you did it, Piotr, I think in your Yalta book. What's the difference? It's made Central East Europe, Central Eastern Europe. I think it's a very important question. And Masbach called Eastern Europe, but means Central Europe. He doesn't speak about Russian. The first. The second question. Can we still speak 25 years after the fall of the Soz bloc about post-communist condition? Should we maybe take the year 2014 as a break, the beginning of the new periodization, maybe?
First, Laszlo.
Thank you. I should like to add something to the last paper of Bea Hook. I think it's very interesting that the tendencies she finishes with the sentiment post-impressionism and the rest in Hungary. It was told in other means, and already in the 60s, this is the so-called post-impressionist, post-impressionist Gresham post-Nagybánya tradition, which was considered by the avant-garde art history, even already in the 60s, like a compromise between the communist state and the follower of Aurel Bernat and people like that. One remark. The other remark is again even more fascinating, that you speak about the influences of the secession, Belle Époque, and so on, and Gödöllő and folk art at about 1900, and a kind of globalization, provincialization in this Hungary and Eastern Europe. And in the same time, better to say, in 65 or 68, I don't remember exactly, it was a SIHA conference or congress in Budapest, and we applauded a Norwegian scholar who was speaking about the relationship of the Belle Époque and the hippism in 68 hippism worldwide. And so I think in the history we are making how to tell it, a critic of the history writing. I think we can understand also this overlapping of different styles and different scientific approaches. So 60s, an interesting closing of the 1900 tendencies with hippism, and 68, and 60 years again, the same thing is a kind of post-globalization tendency, and both are parallelly working. Thank you very much.
I have a question or some remarks to the first presentation. And when I look at the cover of two covers of the books that Katarzyna Murawska-Muthesius mentioned, by Białostocki and Thomas de Costella Kaufmann, who shows court architecture, I think they don't only refer to Latin or Renaissance culture, but the expressions of the cultural values of the ruling classes in the areas which were populated predominantly by serfs or slaves. And I think this is the problem of the history of art that works or deals with cultural identities, uses concepts of civilization, and omits the question of production and historical materialism. And it is particularly striking when we read today the writings of dissident writers of the late 80s, like Milan Kundera, The Tragedy of Central Europe. In this essay, Kundera actually reproduces, he equates, like many dissident writers, freedom with the freedom of market and celebrates the Western civilization without any critical remarks. And he produces the other of barbaric Soviet civilization, which I find that we need to revise this cultural constructions. In particularly, I think that the book by Maria Todorova, Imaginary Balkans, should be a caution today. This book is a record of racist, of reductionist stereotypes, which are solely based on cultural values and identity. And if we read this book today, I think the only values, the reports or records that hold today were not written by writers, by intellectuals, by people of culture, but engineers who are describing precisely the material conditions. And today, most of these things are impossible to embrace. For example, for me, the most striking example in this book of what kind of deadlock is if we omit economy. It was the quote in this book that, for example, people in the Balkans were inclined to work hard, or they weren't inclined. This is the remark I want.
Thank you very much, Krista.
Thank you very much. So far, it has been absolutely very challenging. I have a question to Katarzyna and to Eva. It's also maybe a comment. Well, for Katarzyna, I had the impression that you kind of reduced the identity to national identity only, and but I think that contemporary identities are much more multiple, and that they are. We are not only national creatures, but we are belonging to some much broader communities, as it is global community, for example, art historians. So, and the second question goes to Eva. I absolutely agree that that you notice sometimes that the interpretations of foreign art historians, colleagues from abroad, are kind of wrong. They give another meanings to artworks. And you talked about this, what was the solid local narratives. So how do you imagine it? I have serious doubts about this achievement, that it could be achieved, actually.
Thank you. Now, Emmy, you second. Okay.
I have a question for Evan that follows from Krista's. I sort of agree with you, and as the outsider here, one of few, I wanted to ask whether you really think that sort of solid local narrative is possible, because I, as an outsider, find it, and who builds her research on, all of those individual narratives, talking with different art historians, critics, and artists, I often find it frustrating to negotiate all those different narratives. I've never found a coherent one, and I've more often found contradictions, but I think that that's the inherent nature of history and research and memory, and it also changes from, say, the perceptions about history and culture from the 90s to today. So I would also, like Krista, ask whether you really think this is possible and how it could happen.
Thanks. Third, Thomas.
I have a question for Katarzyna, and it's actually in direct response to your question, because I felt that I'm really interested in this idea of Central European selfhood, because I thought that the way you placed it is really in liminal terms, not essentialist at all, as something that's something between personal, local and national identities on the one hand, and on the other hand, the more sort of trans-regional European Western identities, right? And you also really cogently argued that each collective identity is always associated with some kind of violence, on other types of self-identities we may have. and these categories don't have to be compatible, which I think is quite interesting. But so the question is this, because one of the formative ideas for the discursive, but also the more real presence of Central Europe is this idea of the coexistence of the German peoples on the one hand, and the Slavic and the Magyar people on the other hand. And that's something that was, coined as an ego ideal in the 1910s. Some people like Friedrich Neumann and stuff like that. And that's something that really, I don't think it's perceived as such, both in Germany and East Central Europe these days. I mean, in Germany, Mitteleuropa is pretty much Germany, Austria, perhaps Switzerland, whereas in the countries in East Central Europe, it's pretty much East Central Europe. You hardly find people who combine these two sort of linguistic, or whatever you call them, places. On the other hand, in Anglo-America, people use the term Central Europe rather freely, and they conflate, Germany with Poland, Hungary, Czech Republic, and so on. And so it seems to me that ego ideals are always linked with the more external identifications, and I just really wonder whether an ego ideal is at all possible for a region that spans, from West Germany to Ukraine, and then from Estonia to Macedonia. So just wonder what your opinion is on that.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I have a question for Katarzyna. I found your argument very compelling, brilliant in many ways, references to maps and book covers. However, I find book covers a bit tricky as a sort of a material, knowing, of course, the forces of market and variety of different decisions that come into play. You mentioned at the end that your paper has no conclusion, but I would like to probe your knowledge and your experience further and maybe get some more specific examples, more vivid examples from contemporary visual culture that could speak to these emerging desired identities, connecting, of course, with Eva's argument or a call for more specific, located sort of narratives. I wonder if you see in the recent decades some specific other forms of visual culture that can manifest these new identities or new desired identities. Thank you.
We have two questions, Bojana and Maya.
I have a question that I addressed today to you, but maybe this is a question about a question that we will face many times during this conference. What do you think, one of you think? Who has the right to study a particular region? In post-structuralist terms, yeah, we deal with something and we construct other people's subjectivity. So, do I have a right to write only about a group of which I'm a member? Let's say it used to be Yugoslavia, or somebody else has a right to talk about us. I was very angry with Mansbach's book, but then I found in his book, in his part on Macedonia, a modernist painter and no Yugoslav historian Macedonian included ever mentioning. So they are always, I believe, pathetically, they are always these two gazes, So outsiders look and insiders look. But insiders look must be translated in some bigger language, yeah?
Maybe in English.
I didn't mention English.
There will be a second. And Steven Mansbach had no time to come, unfortunately. Maybe there will be. Yeah, Maya.
I have a question for Bea, and I find it really interesting your analysis or mentioning of the James Elkins review on Mansbach's book, and especially these categories that you mentioned of regional or options for the artists from Eastern Europe to be regional, parochial, or provincial. I find it fascinating. And then you mentioned exile as another option, moving. So do you think these categories are something that you can agree with in terms of the first globalization period? Because if we think about contemporary art and the globalization, which is post-89, these categories cannot stand the ground. If you would elaborate on that.
Thank you very much. I also actually have the same concern of the lady there, because I'm a PhD student and I'm writing about Bosnian art. And I'm not even Bosnian, I'm Italian, so I'm also thinking, am I right to, talk about a nation which I don't come from? And it's funny because yesterday I was also asked whether such a contemporary art scene in Bosnia exists, so I'm questioning. And so if you could clear a little bit more the notion of context and identity, and also you were mentioning Hungarian artists not being well represented in the international art scene, and I'm actually doing the same with Bosnian artists, so yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you very much. That was the last question, and before I give you the floor, let me just briefly refer to what Marina said about the title of my book, because that was a pretty huge story. First of all, I use Central Eastern Europe because I wanted to differentiate part of Europe from the Soviet Union, and I borrowed this from political science, political scientists who use this in the same purpose. But in Poland, in Polish publication, it was not a problem. But I came to Michael Lehmann from Reaction, and he said, "What does that mean, Central Eastern Europe? Something like this does not exist in English." So I tried to persuade him. Yeah, there are some political scientists who use this. No, he said that must be Eastern Europe. So, but I just wanted to talk to him and explain that Eastern Europe also refers to Russia. He said, no, Russia is not in Eastern Europe. So I was confused, but frankly speaking, the title was Art and Avant-garde in Eastern Europe, but in the text, I was allowed to keep Central Eastern Europe. So this is sometimes, very complicated story. The same as you said about the covers, right? The book covers. It's frankly speaking, the publishers do that. I was so happy that Michael Lehmann, did this Misa Tomic. But the first one, I mean, in terms of Yauta, he wanted to put on the cover the Sándor Pinczéhely, this sickle and hammer. And I said, well, there will be that problem, because it was used before. And then there was the Fehers, painting. Okay, this floor is yours.
All right. So, perhaps I will start first because there was because the first question from Marina was about terminology. So I can only concur with you that there is. I think that I have alluded to that in my paper, that there is a total. The term. There is no fixed terminology. There are no fixed boundaries, and there is no fixed terminology. And as you say, I'm not going to repeat what you have said, but certain authors would obstinately stick to their preferred terms, such as Stephen Mansbach would always stick to Eastern Europe, although technically speaking, he speaks about the territory of Zwischeneuropa, of East Central Europe, whereas other authors would prefer to use the term Central Europe. So, so hence, we cannot, you're absolutely right that we cannot sweep under the carpet the problem with this volatile terminology, and ask the question, it's obviously pointing to this kind of floating signifier nature of Eastern Europe and to the constructed nature of East Central, Southeast Europe. And in my other texts, I have actually focused more on this issue of terminology, and I've been listing the terms that were used by various authors at various periods throughout the 20th century to name the regions. And there is a long list from the New Europe, the belt of political change, and there are some more dramatic terms as well, which of course now I'm too excited, so I cannot remember them. But it is a problem, and it actually, I don't know whether, shall I say, let's try to invent a better term? I don't think I want to do that. I think we will remain in the state of kind of fluxus, flux, fluxus perhaps as well. Yeah, I mean, that's the fact, and that points to the kind of fissure, to the problem.
But it depends also on the historical moment, because, in different historical moments, this vocabulary is different. As I said, post the Yalta, Central Eastern Europe. And if you talk about, as Tom Kaufman said yesterday, we had a pretty long discussion. But he defended Central Europe because this material.
Because it's American attitude. But sorry, just one more thing. Just after 1918, there was this first period of actually establishing the Eastern European identity, borders and terms, and there were two journals established actually in Prague. One was Central Europe. And then it was changed, then was it the same journal? That was another journal, which was called Eastern Europe. So in the same period, you have two journals which dealt with more or less the same region. There was a kind of a nightmare from the very beginning. The term New Europe, which was used in 1916, would reappear after 1989. So there is a constant use constant problem, sorry.
To the same question. So I think that we have to make a difference between saying Central Europe, Eastern Europe, or saying Central European art, East European art. Because the concept of Middle Europa was created in 1915 by Friedrich Neumann. So that's a very clear political, economic idea that was introduced with regard to a certain economic area that would have opened up for Germany if. And as Piotr said, we have to be very strictly sticking to the historical period we are talking about, because I think that we have to remember that such a concept of East European art was non-existent. Nobody before 1989, and tell me if you remember otherwise.
Białostocki.
Well, but considering, Eastern Europe, I mean, nobody among the living artists in Eastern Europe had a regional consciousness. Somebody was Czech or Romanian or Hungarian. Nobody I remembered or nobody I knew considered themselves as East European. That concept was created from the outside, basically from English universities, American universities, where it was easier to set up a studies of East European art department than a Czech or Polish or Romanian or Hungarian department, let alone that none of these individually attracted too much attention or could have the funds and so on. So, and in defense of Mansbach, I have to say that the problem with his book probably is that it was written exactly in the wrong moment, just prior to 1989. And he was writing it for an American audience, an American readership, to which he had to introduce every basic concept. What is Serbia? What is Croatia? What is Hungary? How the history of these countries had been...
something like this.
Exactly, for an audience that was not really differentiating between Slovakia and Slovenia and Budapest and Bucharest. So he had to really put down those basic things, and it was kind of a translation. It was a translation of this culture to an audience that had absolutely no knowledge of it. And so we who read it, who of course know this area from the inside, more or less, we of course were a little bit appalled or surprised. How does all this look with the eyes of an outsider, somebody who is translating it? I mean, everybody could experience who wrote an article to a home publication and to a foreign publication that you cannot translate your own article. You have to write a different text to your home audience and to an audience that does not know all the things that your home audience knows, but has a total different horizon. So I think, going on from this to the questions that refer to the solid local narrative and how to achieve the right way of. So I think that this is a very difficult question, and this is one of the reasons I'm so glad that we are together here and we can discuss these things, because it is, for example, we have to put down that probably somebody who wants to write about Estonian culture needs to know the Estonian language. So I think that the language of a culture is probably very important in order to be able to understand that culture. On the other hand, of course, we can have a lot of local publications that have been translated, and we have already a lot of sources that are translated, so probably we can go by that also to a great extent. So somebody writing a review volume or a kind of overarching study about the culture or the art of this region can probably go by translated articles, but translated articles as a selection of the whole, so you have to know that. And so the language, I think, is kind of important. It's probably an unfulfillable condition in case you write about 6 different countries, because nobody's likely to know, at least in that depth, 6 different languages. On the other hand, so to answer the question, who could do that well, I think that at least it is necessary to consult locals, local scholars, and the more the better. Exactly because of the fault lines within each local national culture, I think that it is good if you don't select only 1 or 2 local scholars, but a representative of each and every trend within that given culture. And if you consult at least 5, 6 local scholars, probably you can make a rather valid image for yourself of that culture, and I think that might be a solution. There is no absolute solution, of course, but at least some. And was there anything else?
Okay, while you think, then maybe I respond to your defense of Mansbach, and at the same time answer the question about the categories James Elkins introduced, because I do fully understand what you say about the difficulty that he had to face to introduce this region to an audience that had no idea about it. But it was still at the end of the 90s where these kinds of art historical trends that we were talking about were underway. So it is still questionable whether you undertake such a project without the aim to kind of make it also interesting for any kind of audience. Because what happened, and then this comes forth not only in Elkins but other reviews, that okay, now we recognize that these guys did the same things as what happened, at other places, and then here comes James Elkins, who is like a very rigid theoretical thinker, and then most probably he also had some personal issue with this author, because this review is not just a 2-page review, it's really like a study, and James Elkins otherwise has nothing to do with East Central Europe. So, but anyhow, but he is totally interested in issues of is art history global, or what do you do exactly with this specific problem that there is a shared visual or artistic language, but there are geographical, political, historical conditions, and then there are individual choices. So I think that this model that he offers for different species of regionalism is very much fits for this period. And then this is in an attempt to really better sort out this complex question, other than just falling back on, the model of backwardness, even without calling it backward, because this is what Elkins actually says, that if you cannot present this art without references, constant references to Western models, then you are actually doing a disservice to this art. So when he says that he calls regionalism the situation when somebody knows what's out there but continues doing their own business, nevertheless, which does not mean that they necessarily ignore what's happening out there. I think this you may be able to transpose onto the contemporary situation as well. I don't know if the glocal would be an adjective to give a more contemporary angle to the situation. And then the Hungarian artist Tamás Kaszás, that you yourself also work with, I could place him in this category. Parochial, as Elkins describes, is someone who is afraid to find out too much about international developments in order to keep their own pioneering position, or seemingly pioneering position. This is a bit hardly thinkable today because, globalization is having like several waves already. But I just remember this conference where some of us were and met last time in May in Berlin, when it closed with a podium discussion, and Via Lewandowski, ex-DDR artist, participated, and then he said something that came to mind now, because a solid narrative about art under communism is that these were isolated cultural landscapes, hardly any information went out or in, and he said that, and it gave such a freedom, and he used the word freedom that we normally do not associate with this time, because he said that, you couldn't really access what's going on out there, and you didn't have to worry about these things. But then he also added that he teaches now at the Art Academy in Leipzig, and he sees that his students who are 20, 21 are also not necessarily interested, at the start of their periods, the kind of identifying who has done already what. So this is maybe also transposable. And then provincial, the artists who cannot access international developments for political or economic restraints, is certainly also there, but thanks to the internet, is hopefully less and less so. So maybe this is the category that we could least tolerate these days, or least buy. And then this is also the question that the exile or migration, when you are somewhere else, not because you choose to be there, but because you kind of like pushed out of your country, staying as a Hungarian now, clearly gives certain shadows. And just one more thing I would want to comment on is not necessarily the definition of Eastern Europe or East Central Europe, because there were ample responses to that, but Marina's other question, whether the term or the conceptualization post-communism is still valid, or maybe 2004 should be a new beginning. And then if I address that from the perspective of empire studies, then I would have a rather polemic answer to that, because 1989, the political changes, is often defined as the first period actually when these countries had gained some sort of an independence. They were not part of larger unities. And if you wish, then you couldn't say that in 2004 they lost again this national independence because they became part of a bigger unity, the European Union. And that was a bit of consideration in our research group, whether we want to reach this conclusion in a very, very kind of like gloomy way, that these small Eastern European nations have to understand that it's nichts weird in terms of national self-governance.
Okay, I owe you certain answers. So perhaps this issue of post-communist condition, I'm not sure whether I understood what you have said, but I will talk to you about it later. But just answering Marina's question, whether the term post-communist condition is still valid. I think that as long as we do not deal with the kind of various aspects of communist identity, I think that the term post-communist condition is valid. I mean, as long as we do not deal with communism and the positive contribution of communism to our shared Eastern European identity, even if imposed on us, projected from outside, then the term post-communist condition won't go away. I think that's my opinion. I know, provocative, but now there were several questions about this notion of ego ideals and the ego ideal, how applicable it is and how problematic it is. And of course, I agree that it is very problematic. I thank you very much for the remark from the lady on the right. Jana Sokołowska, the child, about the kind of social aspects and that obviously both Białostocki, I mean those kind of early modern scholars book written at that side dealt obviously only with aristocracy and royalty and taking this class loaded identity as the identity of the region. So that's a very valid point, and I can only agree with that. As to Todorova, I'm not sure whether I have actually understood everything what you have said, because she's far from racist. She's actually pointing, yes, she's actually pointing to something else. She's pointing to the fact that the Balkans were racially discriminated. And this is what you have said.
Yes, but I also said that many writers, that in the end of the book, she recalls Václav Havel or Milan Kundera or Czesław Miłosz. She also worked really critically. We can notice that they also reproduce these stereotypes when they create Eastern Europe and try to distinguish from the Balkans.
Oh yes, of course, yes.
Also, like Kundera creates the other. And it is Soviet, barbaric, Russian other. So they reproduce the same patterns as Western thinkers. And I was trying reading this book to map the pattern of this reductionism, and I think it is based on the fact that they don't consider economic conditions, the modes of production. That they rely solely on the concepts of culture and civilization.
Mm-hmm. Well, it may be so, and this is also, the particular predispositions, and I mean, you may say that Kundera is as elitist as, as earlier scholars. So perhaps we need to have another, approach, another go, the kind of shared, another ego ideal, as kind. I don't know. Again, we would never agree because of the peasantness, which will be the feature, for instance, of the Eastness, would never be the feature of the, Middle Europa, etc., etc. So, but anyway, thank you very much for those very, very, very valid remarks. Eva, I will continue with that because I want to continue with the issue of the ego ideals. Then now, Krista, well, you said that I'm reductive well, obviously I am reductive and essentializing, etc., but any paper is reductive and essentializing because you have to remove all those items which do not fit your narrative, or you have to create, in order to create identity, you have to suppress other identities, and that works the same with the paper. However, I would not agree with you, and this is what Tomasz has said, that I actually did not reduce the ego ideal to national identity, because I specifically pointed out to ethnic identity, which is not national identity, or to those features such as modernity, the shared, love of modernity, or communist identity, which I think is the one which we keep sweeping under the carpet, or dissidence, which is again has nothing to do with nationalism. To Tomasz, so you have raised loads of issues which I have actually scribbled down, and then I think that you have asked a question that whether it is, I mean, obviously, ego ideals, not ego ideal. But I still think this is a valid question about ego ideals of this region. Because if we talk about China, or if we talk about Persia, there is something like, or perhaps I think that there is an ego ideal of China because I don't know enough about China. It's quite possible. But there will be this projected ego ideal from outside, whereas our region is incredibly, it's actually, I mean, there is no one ego ideal, obviously, and this is what I think my paper was about, that there is no one ego ideal, hence the question, is there a region? What I'm saying is that we are constructing this region, and we will keep constructing this region, and we have all the reason for actually we have different reason. We have had different reason for actually constructing it. And the forces of the market and, oh yes, the question about the specific examples. That's a very challenging question. Thank you very much for that. No, I'm not going now to list all the kind of works of art which could stand for, those, for the best exemplifications, embodiment of ego ideals. I would like to hear from you, your proposals. My proposals keep, there are several, and they keep changing. So I'm leaving this question deliberately open. Oh yes, although Bojana question was addressed to Beate, I think, but in a way you asked this question. Who are we? You asked the question, who are we? And I still remember, when I was also angry when I read Stephen Mansbach's book, and I thought that this book must have been written by an art historian. Then I was thrilled when I read Jim Elkin's review. Where was it? In the Art Bulletin. In the Art Bulletin. That's right. And I thought it opened up so many. It stimulated quite a lot of thought in the process. And then very soon, Piotr produced, you may say, indigenous book on art in East Central Europe. So I think that Piotr's book is, in a way, that's the most seminal contribution to this field because that was, and actually Piotr's
a different era.
Yes, no, different era, of course, and actually. Well, as I have written in my review of your book, that was the era during which we actually could talk about Eastern Europe, because Stephen Mansbach's notion of Eastern Europe is very problematic. Obviously, I mean, this is the kind of Western construct.
Strictly speaking, it's the post-war construct.
That's right. It's a post-war construct.
Yeah,
so
this is the Yalta construct. Actually.
Exactly. Yes.
No one mentioned here Europa exhibition as well as the catalog.
Okay.
But there was Stanisławski was from here, right? But he did construct the same. He said about Eastern Europe together with Czech surrealism and Czech cubism, together with Russian constructivism. And such a notion as Eastern Europe, that time did not exist. I mean, yes. It was not actually applied for this region. Mm. So, but I understand there was a sort of strategy, marketing strategy. There was the only possible way, to do this for him. But I do not agree with this.
At this point, I would defend Mansbach, because what a Cold War narrative is, that what you understand under Eastern Europe is Russia and Russian art. And for this reason, he left out Russia from this book, with the recognition that there has been ample material produced on that. And then you can clearly question how he handled national units, or he takes countries, which is not the historical reality, not necessary in the time that he writes about. That this is some sort of a thing that I can kind of like more have more sympathy with along the lines that you said.
It's not quite right. I think that Russia was never understood into Eastern Europe. So I think that again, chronologically going, the term Eastern Europe was used after World War II for the Warsaw Pact countries. That was a very precise political category, and it went from East Germany to the Soviet border. And to answer the Kundera question, Kundera was the first who came up with the Central Europe concept, but it was taken up in the late 80s by Central European intellectuals such as Václav Havel, Adam Michnik, George Conrad, who already somehow had the feeling that there is some kind of, well, I'm not saying liberation, but some possibility for free talk. And they were very much enjoying this sense that we can rather call ourselves Central Europe, because this is not determined by such a political bind as the Warsaw Pact. And they saw a certain perspective in that. And that's how the term Central Europe started to gain ground, and that's how it was being used. And then later on, various authors started to give more geographical accuracy to it and pointing out that actually Austria is also Central Europe. And when we go back to the interwar period, Germany is also, Berlin is Central Europe because the Central European art was basically happening in Berlin. So there started to be all these kinds of enlargement of the term, but I think that it was very precise that Eastern Europe meant Warsaw Pact countries, and Central Europe started to be a kind of upgrading of this concept only regarding the former Czechoslovakia, Poland, and Hungary. And then later on it was...
Excuse me, Laszlo, we are a little bit late. So the next questions and answers, please do on the private way. And because this is the lunch time, and we would like to start the next session, the afternoon session at 2 o'clock, and Laszlo Becker will be chairing this. So thank you very much.